These are some videos I've been intending to do for a while. My favourite albums of all time. Now, favourite albums are kind of very subjective from person to person, but they're even subjective kind of for yourself. You can have a favourite band, and sometimes it can change as the decades go on. You could have a favourite album that you hold on and you guard really loyally as your favourite album. But even then, that can kind of change as you get sick of it, or as your ears change and what you hear changes. Potentially, they've got another album that you didn't appreciate as much, and now you're starting to appreciate more. But yeah, very subjective subject. But I'm going to talk about my favourite albums that have consistently kind of been my favourite albums all through my life. So in this episode, I'm going to focus on Black Sabbath, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. So Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was released by a band Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath are credited as being the inventors of heavy metal. Now, that's kind of a little bit up for debate, but I think in the metal rock world, a lot of people would agree, it's almost unanimous, that Black Sabbath are the creators of heavy metal. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, they wanted to get the idea of like the horror movie and put that into music. So they saw horror movies and they wanted to make horror music. They wanted to scare people with music. That was the idea, which hadn't really been done before, scaring people with music. But on top of that, the Geezer Butler, the bass player, was influenced by Gustav Holst at that time, which is a classical composer who created the Planet Suites, in particular the Mars Suite. The Mars Suite is kind of like this war-like sounding piece of classical with like horns, a lot of brass, dun, 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 dun. And it's got a flat fifth in it, that dun, 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 flat fifth, which some people call like the satanic note. It's got the flat fifth is kind of like the tritone, it's also called, is kind of known as the note that was banned from churches like in medieval times. It wasn't like banned by the Pope, they say. It wasn't, but that's the story behind the note, because the note does have that sort of evil feel to it. And when you listen to heavy music through the 80s and even 90s, they depend a lot on that flat fifth. Whenever anyone's creating horror, like heavy music that's supposed to be like scary and troubling, they use that flat fifth, that tritone a lot. And it's used in classical music. It's been used in classical music to capture that evil sort of sound. They depend on that flat fifth because it just naturally has a troubling sort of heavy sound. And that's what Black Sabbath used from their very first album, from their very first track called Black Sabbath. Their first album they released in 1970, it was called Black Sabbath. The first song was called Black Sabbath. It opened up with the sound of thunder and church bells, and then it went into this really slow riff that had that flat fifth. So they kind of created this horror, this upsetting sort of sound that made you go, what is this? What's going on? So I love the first album, Black Sabbath. It's perhaps a little bit bluesy, a little bit jammy. It's got a couple of cover songs in there. It's potentially slightly on the poppy side in that respect. But again, it's a great album, a great debut album from Black Sabbath. Then they went on to record Paranoid, which is a classic, an absolute classic. It's got Paranoid, War Pigs and Iron Man, the classics, the Black Sabbath like classics. It's probably the most famous Black Sabbath album and the most influential album in metal music. Then they recorded Master of Reality. So that's when they started to detune their guitar quite a lot. They detuned it down 3 steps. So one and a half semitones, which gives it a really heavy sound. And the good thing is back then they didn't have the layers of distortion that more modern bands had. In the year 2000s, like around that era when they had the djent sort of, everyone was detuning the guitars and having bigger strings, they were also caking it with distortion, which was kind of taking away from the heavy sound. Back in the 70s, they didn't have distortion, digital effects to coat the sound. So it was very organic. It was very evil and heavy and organic sounding. So that's the great thing about Master Reality. It's heavy, it's detuned, but it's also very organic. And there's some great instrumentals in there as well. The good thing about Tony Iommi, the guitar player of Black Sabbath, he's known as sort of like the riff master, the godfather of creating riffs, but He's also so good at creating instrumentals. And in Master Reality, you see that. Great instrumentals in Master Reality. In Sabotage, there's Sabbath. And there's also one in Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. So the next album they record is Volume 4. Again, another great classic Black Sabbath album. And then they have a writer's block. 1973, they have a writer's block. And they're not sure what to do. The guitar player's no longer coming up with ideas. They think it's over. But then the drought is broken and they come up with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And they release in 1973 the album Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Now, when I was a kid, this album had a massive impact on me. I was young when I first found it. It's a black album. The cover art, it's a black album. It's got Sabbath Bloody Sabbath written across it. All the art is red and yellow, and it's kind of a searing, evil sort of red and yellow colours, like fire almost. It's got Sabbath Bloody Sabbath written in almost sort of like runic, old Anglo-Saxon Nordic runes. Those like Futhark, the Futhark sort of runes. Like the S's are like the lightning bolts from the Sowilo runes. So it's kind of got that, really evil sort of look, the British look too, like very Northern European evil look. Then it's got cover art on it. It's got a bed. And it's got this bed that's got claws like this, with a skull looking down, 666 across the bed head. Looking down at this man in the bed who's the other way around, so his feet are at the foot of the bed, and he's almost like falling off the bed with a snake around his neck, and these sort of like evil, sort of elf-looking demons jumping up at the guy at the same time, like sort of tormenting him. And then at the foot of the bed at the bottom, you've got these claws grabbing these balls. And I remember my older brother saying, "Oh, those balls, they are metal, and those claws are so strong that because you can see that they're crushing the balls and it's crushing metal." And it was just, as a kid, I'm like, wow, that's so cool, that's so evil, that's so, takes your imagination away. But then when you flip the album on the back, you've got the same scene except it's white and the image is blue, icicle sort of blue, with like blue and a little bit of silver and a little bit of green. It's very sort of ice. It's sort of cooling. It's got a bed quilt that's now got a little bit of colour to it. I think it's sort of like a floral pattern on the quilt. The guy's sleeping peacefully. He's blue. He's sleeping peacefully. There's this invisible, like a god welcoming him up to heaven almost. The evil, demons are now that are jumping on him are now women, sort of mourning and like laying against the bed and mourning for him, sort of around the bed, like someone's passing away and going to heaven. But it's got kind of, and the foot of the bed, you've got lions that are sleeping, blue lions that are sleeping. And it's got a sort of like a serene, peaceful, comforting sort of back cover, which is a great contrast to the front cover. And then when you open up the album, it's a double album. Then it's got in the middle, it's got this old sort of, like a bedroom, but it's in a cathedral or some sort of, not a cathedral, like a mansion or a manor or a castle even, with these bedposts and this old or antique furniture. And the band, the Black Sabbath, the band, they've got the shirts off and they're kind of like walking towards you, but they're invisible, almost like they themselves are ghosts. And as a kid, it just takes you on an adventure. When you look at those covers, it just takes your imagination away. It's really great. The cover, it's such an immersive experience. Probably the best album cover art I've seen. So what about the music? So the music, opens up with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Again, this album's got detuned guitars. So they detune the guitars, so it's got that heavy sound. The singing is very good. They come up with a very heavy punch in the face sort of opening, but then they go to a sort of like a chorus or a bridge where it's got acoustic and it's gentle and it's sort of uplifting, and the singing, Ozzy Osbourne's singing is great. Ozzy Osbourne's singing in this album is fantastic. Very gentle singing, a melody, very sort of like, uplifting and hopeful. And then it goes back into the heavy Sabbath Bloody Sabbath section again. Then it's got a guitar solo, but then it goes to the end riff, and the end riff is the heaviest thing I've ever heard, and would have to be the heaviest thing from 1973. It's got this sort of chromatic with sort of like tribally style drums and sort of like a tambourine sort of making it pulsating and tribal sounding. So it's like takes you to this place that's sort of like tribal and yeah, really sort of evil sort of sound to it. But then Ozzy's vocals, he screams. He does it very well. His singing is really technically really good. He sings really high. He hits all the notes. He sings melodies. He actually sings melodies very well, and he screams them, and it just takes your imagination away. And I remember as a child, when I first listened to it, and I think it's even got like cowbelly sounds. It's got that sort of very tribal sort of sound with the screaming. He's screaming, "Where can you run to? What more can you do?" And it just makes you think, wow, it makes you feel powerful. Like you could like just vaporize all the bullies at school. You could just vaporize them with the power of this song. Like it's just one of those songs that just takes you away and gives you this uplifting power feeling sort of thing. Yeah, when I was a kid, that was just remarkable. That was great. I loved it. It was a life-changing experience. Next song's A National Acrobat. So, yeah, one thing again about this album is there's some guitar harmonies in this song. So the riff's got a guitar harmony. So it's got lots of layers. It's actually got lots of layers. The earlier albums didn't have so many layers. This, sounds like they've got more tracks to work with potentially, or they're just using more tracks. And this song has guitar harmonies in it, in the riff. Great song, National Acrobat. I'm pretty sure Metallica covered this song if I'm not mistaken, but it's just a good driving song, and it's also got a really cool riff change in it. Most of the songs in this album have riff changes, and they're not just generic riff changes, they're really great. They take you somewhere else where you're like, oh, what's happening now? Like it's just such a surprise, and it's always really great piece of instrumental music that comes along, and this is no exception. This song has a really great sort of instrumental piece that takes you along. It's also got the keyboard player in this album, Rick Wakeman, which is another thing that this album has that previous albums didn't have, is a lot of keyboards in it. I love keyboards, especially when you've got a keyboard player like Rick Wakeman from Yes. I mean, he's one of the best keyboard players ever. He's very classical and British influenced. Like he's a classically influenced British keyboard player, very fast virtuoso, who was using a lot of the technology, like the mellotron, which is in this album. There's a mellotron in this album, the Moog, harpsichords, pianos. It just brought so much to the music that if you love music itself, there's a lot to offer in this album musically. It's not just heavy, it's very musical. It's got uplifting sections, it's got very sort of classical sections, it's got sort of drug-induced sections, psychedelic sections. It's got a lot of variety in this album, which is why I also love it. Speaking of variety, there's the third song, Fluff. It's kind of like an acoustic instrumental, but it's got harpsichords in it. It's got pianos. It sort of builds up. It starts out with just acoustic, and then it builds up with all this other instrumentation. And it's got that very British sound to it. I really love it. I was brought up with British parents with British culture, and this just takes you back to that sort of Celtic British, sort of that regal sort of, yeah, regal sort of sound. It's got that sound to it. I can't think of the word at the moment. Yeah, anyway. So then it goes on to Sabracadabra. That's the next song. So Sabracadabra is more of a bluesy song. It's sort of like a bluesy, groovy song. But because of the detuned guitars and because of the vocal melody, Ozzy Osbourne's ability to sing really interesting vocal melodies, it doesn't sound like blues. It's kind of got a really cool upbeat sound to it, a little bit different, and again, really fantastic musical riff change in the middle with the keyboards. It just slows down all of a sudden and goes into this really cool instrumental section. Yeah, fantastic. I love it, love it. And then you go to side two. So after that, you flip over the album and you put on side two, and you've got Killing Yourself to Live, which is a fantastic song. My older brother's, this was his favorite song. It's heavy. It's a great riff, but it's also kind of got a major chords in there, very big chords. He's starting to use some sort of big chords, which adds a lot of color to his riffs. So it's really cool. He's using a lot of effects on here. He's got sounds like a very fast sort of phaser effect for the verses. I think it's a song about don't take drugs because you're killing yourself to live. It's cool lyrics, very cool vocal line by Ozzy Osbourne. Yeah, very cool melody and very fantastic singing. Again, another fantastic, really good song. Then you go on to Who Are You? Who Are You? I think a lot of people don't like this song as much. I believe, if I remember rightly, I think the riff was written by Ozzy Osbourne, but I could be wrong. But it's very Bow, bow, bow. It's a keyboard. Some people don't like it. It's a bit whimsical, perhaps, but it's got vocal harmonies over it. Ozzy's got vocal harmonies, which are really interesting. But then you've also got a riff change in the middle of this that's fantastic. It's got pianos going up and down. It's completely different to the riff at the beginning. Again, I think Rick Wakeman must have played a big role in this song because it's got like, yeah, a lot of pianos and moogs going on and just dun 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 dun. Yeah, it's got like a great, yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, you have to listen to it, but it's just, oh, good song, good song. Next one is Looking for Today. Now, Looking for Today, again, another good song. It's sort of like a major song, so it's a happy sounding song, but then it's got a bit of a less than major sort of riff in the middle. Everyone just sits on top of you. The pain begins to eat your pride. Oh yeah, Looking for Today, that's a great song. Looking for today, looking for today. Again, I think it's got, yeah, it's fantastic. I think it's got Rick Wakeman in there a little bit, influencing the direction that they're going, because it's just so creative. It's not typical heavy metal. It's got, yeah, a lot of elements to it. And then the last song, Spiral Architect. So it opens up with an acoustic, gentle acoustic sort of little thing going on with arpeggiating chords, and then it goes into this heavy riff. Sorcerers of madness telling me them time. Really good melody, really good song, like mode of the song is really interesting. The lyrics are good. And then again in the chorus you've got that really interesting, I think there's keyboards that sort of come down on this chord, while there's a piano arpeggiating over the top of it. Of all the things I value most in life, and it sort of drops down. Yeah, fantastic. No, so I'm just sorry, just to, forgive me going through all these songs and from my childhood that I really got a lot from. But yeah, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. It's a heavy metal album, but it's got so much else in it. It's got classical music, it's got instrumentation, it's got gentle pieces, it's got psychedelic pieces, drug influenced pieces. Yeah, it's one of my favourite albums, and it was released pretty quickly too. I think they recorded it in September 1973 and it was released by December 1973. Yes, it's, if you haven't heard it, it's one of those albums you need to hear. It's also those albums you need to hear from beginning to end. You kind of need to sit through the songs. It's not just something you flick through. It's something you need to absorb. And yeah, it's a fantastic album. One of my favourite albums. Black Sabbath, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath.